Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch and YouTube. And if you are looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing chapter 26 of Stepping Wild. Tibs kept his balance as he slowly reached for the tile. Each line had two, sometimes three, tiles that didn't trigger, but weren't always conveniently close for him to crouch on so he could test the next line. He was close enough to a leap would let him land on the other side of the archway that marked the end of the trap, but he decided to cross this as if he had a team. While he could make that jump, he doubted a warrior could, let alone a sorcerer, who focused on their mind more than their bodies when it came to training. Two more rows, and he figured anyone on a team could jump the rest. He put a hand on the tile, shifting his weight onto it, and moved it off as soon as it... Yeah. As soon as it... No, right. Because he's able to do it without triggering it. So I don't want to use shift and I don't want to use move. He put a hand on the tile, shifting his weight. Okay, actually, let's undo that. Adding weight to it. And as soon as it moved it off as soon as it shifted. There we go, that works. After 28 rows, he'd learned to tell the slightest change that would indicate the trigger was active. Only the most sensitive of them triggered from him pushing off. He studied what he was facing. He'd checked all the tiles he could reach from this one, and they were active. The other tile on this the other tile on this line was the other safe tile. On his line was too far for him to hop or even jump if he was willing to risk such a small landing spot. So he backtracked 3 rows and followed the path that took him to the other side of the line to test those. This sign was more difficult to test. Not only were the 2 tiles he stood on wide enough apart, it made crouching unsteady, but there's no comma. So wide up enough apart, it made crouching unsteady, but there were 2 lines back from the one he needed to test. Here, he had little control over how much weight he put on the tiles, increasing the danger of putting more weight than was needed, and dangerously narrow the margin he had to move out of the way. It was why he'd started on the other side. This test, Tibs had decided, was as much about a runner's patience than their ability to find triggers. There were no shortcuts, he sensed, that wouldn't put someone on the team in danger. After the first few that needed enough weight to trigger, someone smaller than him could stand on and not trigger them. The temptation to run across would be high, and one of the featherlight trigger would kill the heavier or slower on the team, probably the fighter. It would be easy to see patterns where there were none. The moss on the tiles seemed to have grown naturally from what he sensed of the essence in them, and looked enough alike and were on enough of the false triggers, one could think that was the trick, until that caused them to step on an active one and kill them. Furman kept the moss on the tiles and location of the triggers the same from run to run. Then, over time, the path could be memorized, but that made the runner susceptible to the dungeon changing where the triggers were without affecting the position of the tiles. Ultimately, only checking each tile each time would ensure everyone survived. He focused three tiles. He found three tiles on that line that didn't trigger with the weight he put on them. With the weight he was able to put on them without causing himself to tip over. Two of them would be safe. Which one? There was no way to be certain, and it was dangerous to assume that because the minimum had been two with each of the other rows, it would be here. It would be here. All he needed was one. One to place a foot on and leap off that everyone on the team could reach, and that would let them cross the remaining distance. On the next round, he checked the last lines. Without being able to use purity, this was taking a toll on him. He stood, selected the best candidate, and stretched until his foot touched it. He transferred his weight, preparing to push the rest of the way. When the tile shifted, he pushed the rest of the way. When the tile shifted and he barely reacted in time to the thunks with a he twitched his weight, preparing to. Okay, all right. I see what I was going for here. Preparing to push. Preparing to push for the leap. When the tile shifted and he barely reacted in time to the thunks. With a curse, he put his foot down behind him to keep from falling, and that tile sunk. Then he had to fight to keep his balance and not fall into either wall of spears. Found the other safe tile on his row and was able to breathe. He chuckled. The walls retreated and he looked at the distance and the chain of decisions that had led him here. He was definitely tired if he let a non-existent team govern his decision making. What he should do was go back to the other side and make the leap. Except that he located a trigger on the row before him that left two, which should be safe. Not a certainty, but as tired as he felt, each step was a chance of getting it wrong. He steadied his breathing, selected the tile he'd use, and put his foot on it, immediately pushing forward. Before he could tell if it moved, he crashed on the floor past the archway and stayed there. Are you going to just lie there? Furman eventually asked. I need to catch my breath. He needed a nap. That wasn't a physical test. Why are you tired? Tibbs had no idea why he chuckled. This much focusing is exhausting. Really? Are all people like that? Didn't any of the ones who came in and looked tired after thinking their way through one of your traps? They didn't make it out of them, they replied dismissively. Those who didn't die on the first trigger screamed and ran right into the next one. When I put a woodling first, they ran from it and into the trap room that killed them. The only one to somehow avoid the traps in the room was the one on your team. He avoided all the triggers? Well, he triggered one, but he was mostly past the blade, so he only got a small cut. He pushed to his feet. Sleep could come later. A few steps ahead, a corridor ended in an intersection to the right and left, to the left and right. There was a door at the end of the right one with a room behind it and a person formed in wood essence with a sword at its hip. The door was made of trunks that didn't touch the floor or the top of the frame, but the gap was too small for anything more than a rat to slip through. An intricate array of essence connected the trunks to each other. Pushing Pushing didn't cause the door to move. Grabbing onto a trunk that to pull had no effect either. I thought we'd agreed the door couldn't be locked. Do you see a lock on it? Furman said smugly. There wasn't. There was no metal essence within the trunks or the array. There was also no gap where you'd have to insert a key. There was something different about the essence that made the trunks, but only in that they weren't like real trees or those the dungeon used as wall. He sighed. Why won't it open? Because, Tibs heard the smile, the door is barred. As the same as it being locked. He rested his head on the wood, against the wood. No, it isn't. You don't need tools to unbar it. This was Mirko's idea, wasn't it? They had to be so proud of how. No, why do you think that? Using technicality sounds like something a helper would do. Mirko wanted a boss woodling before the door again to fight you with. He looked up. He could barely make out the sky through the canopy, but he'd expected it to be darker. They wanted to fight me again? Mirko doesn't like you. And it's you who came up with the clever way of using the literal words to still keep me out of the room? Why does that surprise you? Stowe was never that clever. I'm not Stowe. Tibs nodded. He knew better than to think all dungeons were the same. They were people, after all. He was just tired. Possibly too tired for the run. Stowe had been the muscle. Yeah, that's a different paragraph. Stowe had been the muscle to Ganny's smart. He'd never gotten much of a sense of the dynamic between dungeons and helpers just from talking to them over the years. He pushed away from the door. I'll keep that in mind. The trunks looked ordinary, but their essence marked them as dungeon-made. Since they were different from the walls, it meant there was something in the essence itself that played into how the door worked. There was a structure to normal trees or any object, but it was never quite the same. Metal had spike was the closest word that for how it felt, but even with two swords that looked the same, they'd be arranged differently. The closest word he had for the essence in trees and other plants was flow, along the trunks and into the branches and leaf. There was nothing sharp the way metal, stone, and light were. It was more like water. These still had that sense of flow, but it was structured. There was a sense of intent to it, the way it felt when he willed water into ice. It was still flow, but a different kind. This intent felt, he couldn't think of a word, too tired to approximate, but there was more of a directionality to the sense of flow up and down. He smiled. There were gaps at the top and bottom of the floor of the door. He placed a hand on the trunk before him and pushed up. He felt the thunk more than heard it as the top of the trunk hit the door frame. I was sure I'd arranged the essence so you couldn't tell what it did. It's in how the essence feels, Tibs said, trying to come up with the words to verbalize his thought, and the gaps. It feels like sliding is what should happen, but he moved to the next trunk and tried to move it without success. You did hide how they interact with the array. I've played with puzzle. I'm missing a line here. Um, and you can't tell what it does. Tibs considered. I've played with puzzle boxes that do something like this. Parts move and I have to work out how to align the notches in the wood so the next piece will move, and it's a series of them until it's unlocked. He lowered the trunk in place. How hard can it be for you with your elements? Tibs chuckled. I just got wood. I had to do them blind. He moved the one he tried and it went up and down. The first move had no limitation, but that imposed them on the further ones. What what I'll use is that no matter how skilled the artisan who makes one is, they can't get the wood perfectly flat against each other. So there's just a bit of a play I can test and get a sense of what can and can't move. I don't have that here, and you've put so much essence in the array I can identify that I can't sense its interaction with the trunk. At least there didn't seem to be void involved. He wasn't sure he was alert enough to deal with how void lets still make puzzles that weren't bound by their borders. That taken him a long time to work out how to use void from what he'd learned when he ate sorcerers or adventurers who had void as their element. There hadn't been many of them, even after the guild had let people from outside Craggle Rock do runs. Furman didn't have that, so Tibbs was confident it wouldn't be involved, which meant this would simply test his patience and ability to pay attention while tired. At least a mistake here wouldn't risk killing him. When the door swung inward, Tibbs almost toppled over. He'd been focused on the next step, and the current trunk not moving only registered in needing more force. So he'd pressed his hand against the bark for better grip, and the door had opened effortlessly. He regained his footing with one on a tile among too many of them for Tibbs to count in his tired state, each with an arcanus on them. He lifted it off and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw Ike. At least it had been one of the safe tiles. Did you have to keep the tiles on that door? Did you have to keep the tiles have that door? Has that door? I didn't feel like spending the essence to change it. Furman said casually. Tip snorted. We were just hoping I'd fall and trigger multiple of them. On the other side of the room was the armor stand. He reached it easily and was impressed with what he found. The armor was simple, supple. The armor was simple, supple, but thick leather with ties to tighten it in place. The wooden scabbard at its hip held a plain sword similar to the one he'd fought with on his previous run, except for one thing. You didn't have enough essence to make it the same length as mine? You insisted you needed the picks, the intricate weaving needed to give them the strength and flexibility yours had took much more essence than I expected. Tips nodded. He'd willed his to behave the way he needed them. Wait, so you don't have to will them to remain? No, I've made them. Then how do you make sure they don't break down into essence? How do I make sure I made them? Why would they break down unless I unmake them? I haven't worked out how to make something that stays. That broken sword stayed until you absorbed its essence. I was still willing it to exist. I've gotten so used to doing that with what I need, I keep doing it unless I need more items than I can maintain. How many can you keep? 7 easily. Beyond that, it depends on how much attention I can afford to give them. I've made 19 and held that for a while before the headache got too much. But I was in my room and nothing distracted me. He stretched his arm, holding the sword. He'd have to be careful of keeping the reduced reach in mind. It had been a long time since he'd had to fight with a sword that wasn't exactly how he wanted it to be. He put the armor on, holding this. Put the armor on. The picks were held in a long pocket, and once he tightened the straps, moved about, testing its flexibility. How did you come up with this? It's nice. One of the people I absorbed had it. One with one within. It had thin and frayed essence. I made you something better. It was old. The fraying and thinning happens over time. I also played around with how much protection it gives and other things that can help you. But that's for if you make it far enough. And if they come up on the list, Murkoff is adamant the list has to govern what ends up in the chests. Tibs chuckled. Kenny was the same. She hated it when Stowe put something, especially for me, in one of them. This Stowe made items to help you? We were friends. But it's our role to eat you, Furman said, baffled. To test me. But I'll eat you when you fail. They were quiet. When they spoke, it was hesitatingly. How did your friend accept that? I could never eat Murkoff. It was just how things were. We never talked about it. His floors were hard enough. I nearly died a few times. Pushing me as hard as he could was something he felt he had to, as my friend. I think he preferred I die in him instead of at the hand of the world. And you were fine with your friend eating you? Tibs paused. He wasn't sure he'd been able to make he wasn't sure he'd be able to make the dungeon understand. Stowe was one of the rare persons outside of my team who treated me like something more than an object to be used and thrown away. He helped me, he broke the rules to do it. He protected the town as best as he could. I knew he'd eat me one day. I was trapped there, having to do runs after runs, but that wasn't his fault. It's the guild that did that. They are the one I hold responsible for that. He ground his teeth for all the friends Stowe ate. He let the breath out. The guild was for later, once he was strong enough. Now it was time for the run, for him to build up that strength. And that concludes chapter 25 of Stepping Wild. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter will be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read this story, it is available on Royal Road for free. If you want to read ahead of that and support me in the process, that is on the Ream story, where we're at least a dozen chapters ahead. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch and YouTube. Links are in the notes. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.